All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here at the end of a very long and a very intense day. My name is Kate Waters. I'm the Executive Director of Crude Accountability. We are an American human rights and environmental NGO that has been working in the OSCE space for a number of years. We work on human rights and environmental violations, we also are part of an international campaign called the Prove They Are Alive campaign, which we are founding members of, that has been very actively part of the Civic Solidarity Platform, which is a big international network of civil society organizations. And two of our speakers are joining us on Zoom, so they'll be up on the screen in a momentarily. But I want to welcome you to our session on human rights violations, militarization of public spaces, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearances in the United States in 2025. Crude Accountability, as I said, has been participating in the HDIM for over a decade. And this is the first year that we have felt compelled to hold a side event on the critical decline in the human rights situation in the United States, and particularly to focus on issues described in the title of our event. Crude Accountability, as I mentioned, is a founding member of the international Prove They Are Alive campaign, which has documented enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan since 2013. And turning our research to this topic in the United States has been a really sobering effort for our team. Over the past 8.5 months, the United States has experienced a precipitous fall in basic human rights protections. On day one of his presidency, Donald Trump signed over multiple executive orders, essentially dictating through fiat changes that went into effect immediately. These were followed by additional executive orders and proclamations on a variety of issues, and you'll hear more about that from one of our speakers. Attacking diversity, equity, inclusion, also known as DEI programs, gutting U.S. foreign assistance, including entire agencies such as USAID, attacking U.S. universities and other institutions of higher learning, defunding scientific and medical research, and drastically reducing funding for critically important healthcare services, taking over the country's premier art institutions with presidential loyalists, and threatening journalists and media outlets perceived to be disloyal to the president are only some of the attacks that have increased exponentially over the past months. Perhaps most disconcerting is the militarization of American towns and cities, including Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, Memphis, and Portland, Oregon, by National Guard, called up by Trump in violation of U.S. law, which requires that governors request National Guard assistance in times of emergency. Trump has also threatened to place National Guard in Oakland, Baltimore, and other cities. Every day, there's a new town that somehow gets on that list. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, as they're known, agents, their faces masked, carrying weapons and wearing body armor, patrol American communities, detaining men, women, and children, often as they go about their daily lives in cities and towns, in places of worship, at school, at work, in their homes, and on the street for arrest and deportation. Most of these people have no criminal record. Many of them have lived for decades in the United States. Some of them are actually U.S. citizens, and all of them deserve and are entitled to basic humanity and observation of and respect for their basic human rights. This last issue is the focus of our side event today. We're going to take a deep dive into the unprecedented violation of human rights occurring in the U.S. in the form of arbitrary detention, deportation, and enforced disappearance of thousands of people. And we're really fortunate today to have with us 3 experts who will speak to this issue. Jeffrey Dunn, who's Crude Accountability's Director of Research, will begin by speaking about the Trump regime's empowerment of the Department of Homeland Security and ICE and what this has meant for migrants in the U.S. Jeff is the Research Director of Crude Accountability and has 5 years' experience working in the fields of human rights, environmental protection, and climate change. He's worked on the cases of enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan, including the production of a report on enforced disappearances there, a submission to the Universal Periodic Review of Turkmenistan by the UN Human Rights Council in 2023, and assisting in the production of a report on the infamous Ovadan Tepe and Akdaş prisons. He's also assisted in the production and editing of reports on enforced disappearances across the OSCE with the Turkmenistan Working Group and the Working Group on the Fight Against Torture of the Civic Solidarity Platform. He has a Bachelor's of the Arts in Russian, Eurasian, Polish Studies, and Political Science. He will be followed by Lena Olberding, who's a research intern at Crude Accountability, who will focus more in-depth remarks on the impacts of ICE actions on individuals who are taken into their custody. She received her bachelor's degree in political science and economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and she learned about Crude Accountability there in one of her classes on Central Asian politics and has been working in human rights since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. She's worked on a variety of different issues related to Russian sanctions and Russian court decisions and human rights issues, and she is a research intern at Crude Accountability right now for us. And finally, Douglas Wake will comment on the relationship between the phenomena and the OSCE principles, including the OSCE Decalogue. Douglas is an independent analyst who has focused for more than 4 decades as a diplomat and international civil servant on human rights, democracy, the rule of law, development, and European security. Doug was a U.S. Foreign Service officer for 28 years, has held senior OSCE positions, including First Deputy Director of ODIHR, and has led several ODIHR election missions. He's a strong believer in the principle that the OSCE commitments in the human dimension are equally applicable to all participating states, and that implementation of these commitments is of legitimate concern to all. So we're really pleased to have all of you with us today. And with that, I turn the floor over to Jeffrey Dunn, who will begin with his presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's come to this event. I can't see the full room, but I'm just grateful to anybody that's going to, be there to listen to this. I think I'm just going to start out and be quite frank. What we're dealing with the United States is frankly just unprecedented. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Trump regime is fundamentally a tyrannical government, a fascist regime. And the investigation that we began back in the beginning of this summer, specifically looking into what is happening to people in ICE detention, is the human proof of that. So, as Kate said, I'm going to go into more of the generals, not too much into specific cases. So beginning with that, the Trump administration has issued 8 executive orders specifically targeting immigration since the beginning of this regime, and 4 proclamations. Of those executive orders, they specifically target birthright citizenship, bypass due process rights for immigrants or those detained by ICE, pave the way for travel bans outside of judicial jurisdiction, meaning that courts can't intervene, essentially. Target or eliminate a number of programs designed to assist migrants, and even some of the most brazen executive orders target American citizens themselves, by calling for the withholding of federal funding to certain jurisdictions, i.e. cities, what the regime likes to call sanctuary cities, and nonprofits, as well as investigating or prosecuting nonprofits involved in assisting migrants. One particular order, Executive Order 14161, even provides resources to denaturalize U.S. citizens, i.e. strip them of their citizenship. It's a very very small line in the executive order that it doesn't explicitly say it, but it references a law in U.S. code, which is the denaturalization process. Regarding the proclamations, as I said, there's been at least four. In particular, they allow military assets, including personnel, to detain and deport migrants, suspend the entry of any migrant engaged in an invasion of the United States at the southern border, which is a rhetoric consistently used across this regime, enacts travel bans on certain nationalities, and restricts H-1B visas, setting petition fees to exorbitantly high prices, 100,000. All of this to specifically target migrant communities, but it has a trickle-down effect, and it is affecting American citizens as well. But the executive branch, the Trump regime, is not the only part of the U.S. government that is at the forefront of what is happening. The Supreme Court has also been right there with the executive branch in a number of cases that they've determined this year, which fundamentally undermine the rights of migrants. There are a variety of these, but the most notable of them right now is Perdomo versus Noam, which essentially allows ICE to racially profile individuals, i.e., they can stop, ask people, even detain people without warrant, simply based on their skin color, simply based on their accent, their country of origin, anything that they might flag as suspicious. They now have a reason to stop people. And of course, it's not just Supreme Court SCOTUS, it's also the United States Congress, regardless of political affiliation. Congress passed the quote unquote One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which gave exorbitant amount of money to ICE and specifically immigration enforcement. So the bill gave ICE a budget of 75 billion US dollars for the next 4 years. For 2025 alone, I believe it's something around 27.8 billion US dollars. To put that into perspective, that's roughly between the military expenditures of Canada and Turkey. So there is a law enforcement agency within the U.S. government that has an equivalent military budget, has an equivalent budget to the militaries of Canada and Turkey. It's insanity. And of course, I'm just shouting, I'm just giving you numbers here, but this has a really real human impact. That current impact, based on the research that we have right now, is over 59,000 people are detained or in ICE or Customs and Border Patrol custody. Between 170 to 400,000 people have been arrested by ICE. That's roughly an average of 708 arrests per day based on the information that we have. Detentions peaked to the highest that we've seen since 2019. Granted, that's only as far back as ICE data goes, is 2019. They peaked in August of this year with 61,000 people detained. And there's been between 200,000 to 400,000 deportations. Many of these cases, as Lena's going to get into here, are people who had no access to due process, no access to legal representation. And specifically, when we're talking about enforced disappearances, these are also people who their families didn't know where they were. They didn't know where they were. If they did have legal representation, their legal representation was not told where they were. There is an insidious effort by the Trump regime to deprive not just basic rights, as Kate was pointing out, basic human rights to those detained by ICE, which I remind everyone is not just immigrants. U.S. citizens included, U.S. residents included. But it's also to deprive them of their U.S. constitutional rights. Basically, our report, as we'll get into, demonstrates that there are blatant violations to the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of course, to the Nelson Mandela rules of the basic treatment of prisoners under the UN, and the U.S. Constitution as well. It is abhorrent. So I think I'll stop there before I ramble, and I will hand it back over to Lena or to Kate, whoever.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We will now turn the floor over to Lena, who will get into more of the human stories related to this, to what's going on. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate. Just to remind you all, over 70% of the people that are being detained by ICE have no criminal record. And this is data given to us by the Trump administration itself. And as I've counted in my research, I read through the Federal Performance-Based Detention Standards Handbook, and there are over 20 violations of the detention standards based on U.S. federal law on detention. And most of these facilities are federal in of themselves. But so we're not only violating international law here, we are also violating U.S. domestic law, and we're simply violating the human rights of people who aren't even criminals. Not to say that criminals deserve to have human rights violated, their human rights violated, but just to see, like, 70% of these people have not done anything wrong. And of those who have criminal records, simply sometimes ICE defines a criminal record as a traffic ticket, a miscentered license plate, driving the wrong way down an alleyway. So to go into some more examples of who are being put in these facilities, we have a man who was selling tortillas. He owned a local tortilla stand. His daughter only learned of his detention through a Facebook video of ICE activity in the area. She was not informed of his detention for multiple weeks. We have a pregnant woman who was thrown to the ground, beaten by ICE and thrown into the back of a van, later causing a miscarriage. We have a DACA recipient, promised the American dream, now unable to complete their university education. A biochemistry PhD who was working on a cure for Lyme's disease at one of the most renowned institutions in the world. He was arrested and detained for traffic tickets that were from over 8 years ago. We have a law student also attending one of the most prestigious institutions in the US who was similarly detained for traffic violations. He was deported 1 month before his graduation from law school. Now he is unable to practice, has hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, and is never allowed to return to the US. One of the saddest cases I have encountered was a father who was unable to find childcare for his 6-year-old son. He brought him to a hearing at immigration court. The boy was separated from the father, detained, and according to all recent reporting I can find, the father has not been able to contact his son since. The definition of an enforced disappearance, as according to the UN, is the arrest, detention, or abduction of persons by or with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of a state or an or a political organization, followed by refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of freedom or to give information on the fate or whereabouts of those persons with the intention of removing them from the protection of law for a prolonged period of time. In speaking to immigration attorneys, I read them these definitions, or this definition, and one immigration attorney informed me that in a state with relatively low ICE volumes, as we are seeing today in the Northeast, he has had over 500 clients, and he stated that all of his clients would meet that definition for the minimum 2-hour standard. He told me he could not think of a case where he or the family were able to contact the client or know the whereabouts of the client within a day. He stated that across his firm, in this very small, lower activity ICE state, they have represented over 1,000 people. And he could not think of a single person within the firm that had or a single client that had been able to contact their attorney within this 2-hour standard. He said that with 99% chance, there is no one that he has represented since the start of this administration that has been able to do that. Another attorney in a completely different region of the country informed me with quite a laughing, joking tone that there is no possible way that any of his 200 clients did not meet the definition for enforced disappearance. This is not the only issue that they are reporting to me that they have encountered. They are required to call ICE facilities over and over and over again, and frequently they cannot get through to ICE officers in certain facilities. They cannot figure out where their clients are. In fact, the same attorney who represented 500 people that he says would meet the definition of an enforced disappearance informed me that he can think of at least 3 clients for whom he has shown up to court for a hearing only to be informed by ICE that the client has been transferred to a different institution, and that he was not informed beforehand, and they do not state where the detainee immigrant has been transferred. So he's an attorney showing up to court for someone who doesn't even, isn't even in existence in the system there anymore. The judge proceeds to dismiss the case as it is no longer under their jurisdiction. Now, this isn't the only problem that immigrants, innocent people are facing with our system. Mandoro v. Noam, which is a recent lawsuit in the US, Noam et al., describes the conditions at a detention facility called 26 Fed in Manhattan. So the detainees there are allegedly given 1 military meal per day. The guards eat McDonald's and other fast food in front of them. And they throw the napkins into the cells, as we should call them, every few days. This is the detainee's only source of toilet paper and hygiene products. One woman reported that for the 2-week stay she was at 26 Fed, she did not have access to a single sanitary product. The guards provided them, ICE officers provided them with 2 sanitary napkins for a facility that held over 70 women at the time. Which meant that all of the women left in blood-stained clothes, the ones that were on their period. There were no menstrual products provided, no sanitation products provided. They were not allowed a shower or a toothbrush while there. In fact, the rooms are so crowded with up to allegedly 90 people per 20 square meter holding cell that they must sleep sitting on each other or leaning up against each other. If there is space to lay down, it is frequently next to the only toilet the detainees are offered. There's only 1 toilet per room. They're not allowed out of the detention holding cell. And so there are up to 90 people sharing 1 toilet. What does this mean? This means that frequently the toilets cannot handle the capacity of servicing 90 people, with some detainees reporting that waste has overflowed onto them while they have been sleeping. And again, they are not provided access to sanitation facilities after this. Furthermore, at this facility, and the reason this lawsuit was originally filed was due to the fact that these detainees are not allowed access, confidential, protected access to attorneys, which is their right under US law. All phone calls are monitored by ICE. They are only given 5 minutes. And some detainees have reported that the only time that they were given access to a phone call was at like 1:30 in the morning on a Saturday. And during that time, they were allowed no access. Obviously, they couldn't get a hold of their attorney or family members. Attorneys are not allowed into the facility. They are not allowed to pass any written communication. They are not allowed to email, anything like that. And since all calls are monitored by ICE, there is no confidential attorney. There's no attorney-client privilege constructively. Furthermore, we have Alligator Alcatraz, which is one of our more famous detention facilities, which actually recently, as of this week, has been permitted to reopen during the appeals process. At Alligator Alcatraz, it is reported that detainees are shackled to the floor, sometimes just routinely. Other times they're shackled outside in the hot Florida sun as punishment for noncompliance with guards for up to 12 hours a day. Also, at Alligator Alcatraz, there are reports of toilets overflowing, of swamp water filling the facilities due to inadequate sealage or flooding. When Alligator Alcatraz was shut down, they were in the process of, relocating defendants to certain facilities in California and Texas. However, there are a number of detainees, according to the Miami Herald, over 800, that currently have no record in the ICE database. So you cannot determine where they're located. These 800 people are effectively missing, with some allegedly having been deported, or just their families and attorneys aren't able to contact them. One attorney reported that his client, before even he had his first hearing, was deported back to Guatemala, a similar situation to Kilmar Abrogado, who was deported to El Salvador before he ever had a hearing. While there are issues with tracking the detainees at Alligator Alcatraz, as it is a state-run facility, at its peak, Alligator Alcatraz had around 1,300 people, and there were 400 people left at the end of August. When the Miami Herald reported on this issue, they had a roster of the entirety of the people who were residing there in the month of July, or detained there, I should say. And these 800 people were unable to be located. Frequently, it shows, if you look up their names specifically, it will show call lists for details or transfer in process. But this was over a period of weeks where the status remained the same. So what is the fate of these 800 people? We do not know. And we cannot know, simply. So all of this to say, this is not just a violation of international law. This is a knowing, planned violation of U.S. domestic law. This is not just a concern on an international scale, but it is a concern for the fundamental rule of law and protection of human rights that we have so historically touted as being the bastions of in the United States. As the ruler or the leader of the free world, I believe that it's important to show that our same regulations and our same touting of democratic ideals must also be imposed on us. We cannot allow people to be covered in human excrement, lying on concrete floors. We cannot allow children to fight over clean water. We cannot allow people to disappear without a trace. There are fundamental protections, both internationally and domestically, that must be applied. And yeah, I think that this is just one of the most fundamentally abhorrent issues I have ever run across. And simply the sheer breadth of it is unfathomable. I mean, at every level of the system, we are failing U.S. citizens. We are failing children. We are failing survivors. We are failing legal immigrants who came here to build up our society. And the results of this are unimaginable. So thank you so much for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Lena. Appreciate that. I now give the floor to Doug Wake. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Kate, for, first of all, organizing and facilitating. And thanks to Jeff and Lena for providing, as I think one of you said, very sobering information. I'm a former U.S. government official and an OSCE official, as pointed out by Kate, and it's not a usual role for me to be sitting in front of an audience and talking about the human rights situation in the United States. I speak not only as a private citizen, a U.S. citizen, but I have to say that it's deeply troubling to hear the kinds of reports that we've just heard from colleagues on the Zoom screen here. Really shocking to hear about some of the specific cases and the conditions in some of the facilities that are mentioned. I'm not an expert on the details of these cases and wouldn't take the floor to pretend that I am. But I I do think that, given my background, I can say a little bit about the relationship, as Kate foreshadowed, of these situations to the commitments that the OSCE participating states, including the United States, have undertaken over many years. And I also think I could link that to a little bit broader context than just these specific cases that are mentioned. Everything that's been discussed so far is rather clearly in contradiction to a whole series of commitments that have been undertaken, going all the way back, and we marked this 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, going back to Helsinki 1975, and the commitment to respect fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms. That set of commitments has been supplemented over many years at various first CSCE and OSCE meetings. And for those of us who like to see it kind of in an analog version, I appreciate that ODIHR, my former employer, has now published the 4th edition of all the OSCE human dimension commitments. You can find the same material online, both thematically organized and chronologically organized. And if we go through chronologically, these commitments were supplemented at a meeting I happened to attend in Vienna in 1989, in Copenhagen, where you had the broadest set of international commitments to date relating to respect for the rule of law and due process. The Paris Charter of the same year, which talked about democracy as the only form of government, but also about respect for human rights as a primary responsibility of government. Moscow the following year, the commitment was made that we treat these international human rights standards as common objectives, which do not fall solely within the internal affairs of any particular state. And it goes on. And so far, all of the documents that I mentioned have been adopted with the endorsement of the government of the United States, actually all under Republican administrations. Of course, this has been a bipartisan set of issues for the United States within the Congress, and presidents of both parties have supported the idea that international human rights commitments need to be promoted and taken seriously, both at home and abroad. In relation to what's just been discussed, I draw particular attention to one more OSCE commitment that was undertaken during an administration not only of the same party that is currently in power, but by the same president that is currently in power, in one of the few human rights or human dimension related commitments that's been a product of consensus over the past decade, when it's been very difficult to reach consensus for reasons that go beyond the subject of this session. There was a possibility in 2020 to adopt a decision at the ministerial level on combating torture. This was adopted in the last days of the first Trump administration. And I just read you one of the provisions which I found particularly striking, adopted in December 2020, is that all the OSCE participating states agreed to respect safeguards concerning the liberty, security, and dignity of the person, and ensure that prolonged incommunicado detention and secret places of detention and interrogation are abolished, with the understanding that such detention can facilitate the perpetuation of torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, and can in itself constitute a form of such treatment. So the idea that keeping people for long periods of time without proper notice to their relatives, without proper access to legal counsel, is in itself degrading and potentially a serious violation. So I think we have enough documentation within the OSCE acquis to say that these are matters that are not just concern to American citizens and those of us who have grown up within that particular political system, but are matters of international concern. That's a bit about the commitments, but I also think it's important to look at the commitments in a broader context than just the cases that Jeff and Lena have talked about. Because what's really been shocking for many of us over the past almost 9 months has been the series of developments that fly in the face of other international commitments, more broadly to respect the rule of law, for example, in terms of the independence of the judiciary, a topic that was already in 1989 and 1990 one of shared concern of all participating states in the OSCE and shared agreements that very much mirror what you find in the United States Constitution and in European legal documents about the importance of fair trials, of due process, of access to justice. I mentioned provisions on torture, which are clearly violated, or where there's a risk of violation, not only in the cases that were mentioned, but in cases we all read about early in this administration about the deportation of individuals to third countries, where regardless of the immigration status and the justification for the person being removed from the United States, they were sent to a third country where they were detained without any proper legal process and in conditions that were clearly not meeting international standards. But we can move on and we can look at things like commitments that were undertaken in this century, in the early part of the 21st century, on tolerance and non-discrimination, and then think about the way that this administration has acted with regard to government officials who appear to be targeted for removal based on race or gender or other factors which are not related to their performance, not to mention all of the actions that have been taken against law firms, universities, and other institutions, not because of their conformity with international or national policy standards, but because of political judgments about the particular leaders of those institutions. I could go on a long time, but let me mention freedom of expression, which was not specifically mentioned in the cases that Jeff and Lena talked about. But again, quite a number of the early cases that we saw with detention and efforts to, for example, cancel visas of foreign students seemed clearly to be based only on expression of political opinions, nonviolent political opinions, rather than any criterion that would fall properly within the immigration legislation. Freedom of association, assembly, we see international standards in this book about respect for everything from trade unions to intellectual freedom in universities, and we see the practices in this administration, which I won't go into in detail. And finally, this organization rightly has placed an enormous amount of attention on issues of gender equality and the rights of women. One could look at specific cases of what's happened in this administration, including the things that Kate mentioned about DEI. But I would also look at statements from the administration itself where it has basically rejected the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda that was adopted by the UN Security Council with the endorsement of the United States as a permanent member of the Security Council, and reiterated under Republican and Democratic administrations, and including the last Trump administration, as well as more broadly sustainable development goals, which seem now to be some sort of evil term for this administration, despite them being endorsed not only by the UN, but occasionally referred to also by our organization, the OSCE. So I find it outrageous that this administration has also declined to present the U.S. record to the Universal Periodic Review process of the United Nations. And I find that particularly outrageous as someone who, for decades as a U.S. official, was on the side of greater universality, less selectivity in the way that multilateral organizations dealt with human rights. We rightly complained when only 2 or 3 or 5 countries were singled out in the United Nations or in other bodies, because everyone should have to present their record and should be treated equally. And yet the United States somehow has decided in 2025 that among the 190 plus countries in the United Nations, when it's our turn, we're not going to submit a report. How do we get beyond this? I think civil society has an enormously important role to play, and that's why, despite my long background as a government official and international organization official, I'm very glad to associate myself with groups like this, like the Civic Solidarity Platform, that in another room here is talking about ways to keep civil society engagement going in the OSCE process past 50 years. I would have been there if it hadn't been for this U.S. situation. Of course, I also recognize that, there is a broader European security context. And, we all sit here in this room rightly condemning what is happening now in the United States, which in no way minimizes the fact that a participating state very close to this one is under daily attack from the Russian Federation. And, we don't mean to minimize the violations that are taking place anywhere else, both regard to individual human rights and security. But I'd also stress this principle that goes back to Helsinki and has been reiterated many times, that security is comprehensive, and if there are violations of the rights of individuals within the human dimension, it has broader implications for other dimensions of security. And if security is threatened in the United States as the largest, most populous, and most powerful country in the OSCE region, that's a problem for all of us. So it's not just a problem for Americans. Last points, colleagues mentioned the courts, had quite a few negative things to say. There are obviously also some very proper, brave judges that have issued many decisions over the past 9 months that call into question a whole range of policies that I've mentioned and that colleagues have mentioned. Not all of these cases have been finally decided by the Supreme Court. Some have not, but I still would see the role of the courts in the United States as being quite important. And ultimately, the role of voters is very important as well, because it is up to the people who elect their leaders in the United States to decide whether they're happy with these policies. And in that context, as someone, Kate mentioned, has been an international election observer on many occasions. I'll never be an international election observer in the United States of America. That's not how it works. But I do think it's very important for the U.S. to continue the practice of inviting international observation, including from OSCE ODIHR, because upcoming elections should be independently judged for their conformity with international standards, and that's a practice that Republican and Democratic administrations of the U.S. have had in the past to invite OSCE ODIHR to observe, and I hope that continues to be the case. I'll stop there. I know that there could be questions, comments for any of us, and I again reiterate that I take no pleasure in being in such a forum, but I think it's a necessary forum today.
Thank you so much, Doug. Your comments are really, really hard-hitting and right on the money. We will open up for questions and comments at this point. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand, identify yourself, and we'll take it from there. Yes, all the way in the back.
Yes, my name is Rachel Frizecki. I do human rights work for women dealing with violence. Been doing it in the U.S. for 28 years across the entire country. Have done assessments of different state and federal and international policy on human rights at the U.S. Thank you for your presentation. It was of interest. There are a couple of things I'd like to maybe put on the table and see what you might think about. When you did your presentation, I'm in the Cambridge, Boston area, and there have been certainly some PhD students taken right off the streets, one woman in particular, with her hijab and terrorized. 5 men with covered faces. Fortunately, her neighbor made it clear that he was filming the whole thing. So he gave her some sense of relief, and thank God he was, because it was the only way they knew how to find her. My concern here today was that we didn't bring in any, that you didn't bring in any of the people to whom this had happened to speak, because I know they would definitely do that. I know they would do that in a forum like this. Absolutely. Now, so that was one of my concerns, is representing the people to whom this is done, being in the room. My other concern is that we didn't bring in any of the solutions. There are a number of many members of Congress, the people that went and found the detainees, went into other countries to find the detainees, were assaulted on lines, on picket lines, on lines. None of those people or their work was mentioned. Okay, so I found that a little concerning. I am a little concerned that we upheld the idea that Republican presidents had put a lot of things into place. In particular, that President Trump in his last administration had signed on to anti-torture work and then resoundingly went out and did exactly what he said he wouldn't do. Which is, if anyone knows Mr. Trump, that's who he is. He says no one day and he does it the other day. And so there's really nothing radical about that whatsoever. It's the daily news in America. So I'm concerned that we didn't have solid on the ground items in this room. And I appreciate that you brought the issues up, but I would like to have seen actual work, and I'd like to have seen solutions so that, or the people working on the solutions, so that the OSCE greater body of work, the people in this room would know that Schiff and Raskin and White House and Congress people from all over the country had been flying in and getting their constituents. So I wish we had done more of that. That would have shown that the rule of law and democracy is at work and shifting. It's not coming out of the White House now, which is where we're used to. It's the members of Congress taking up their responsibilities in a way they've never had to do before. So I would like to have seen more of that. I'm also concerned with the fact that our main speaker has been a U.S. government official for most of his career. So I'd like to have seen more people involved in the grassroots work of
Thank you for
this
your
kind of thing.
comment.
So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I would like to talk with you maybe offline afterwards. I
Yep.
think we've been working to gather some of the information that you're talking about. There are a number of people actually who we interviewed who were not willing to be here this afternoon, this evening for security reasons. And so we've been trying to be very mindful of that. We're also at the beginning of this work. So we're, as Jeffrey mentioned, we are putting together a report. So if there's information that you can help us with, we'd be really thrilled to get more of that. I also think it's important for us to have all the aspects. And Doug was very clear that he's here speaking as a private citizen, as an individual person. I think that value is a valuable context, particularly in this setting at the OSCE. But thank you for your remarks. Others?
Good evening. First of all, thank you for this event. My name is Maria Tomak. I represent the Ukrainian civil society. I used to work also for the government for some time, but now I'm back to the civil society. And I have one comment in the question. The comment is that we certainly feel the consequences of the overall degrading situation in the US around the globe. And I like, because you were saying that it's doesn't mean that other situations matter less. I want to support that. And I personally, I don't perceive it as something that, you know, somehow threatens the Ukrainian issue and its importance. But I feel like this overall degrading situation in the US has consequences also for Ukraine, definitely. So like on my side, I would just like to support you and hope that things will get better, but I don't know why when it happens. So, and my question is pretty like basic, simple. How do you see the further developments, where it all goes? Like 9 months passed and now the situation is pretty like worrying. I would put it like this. And do you hope for any reactions like to your to this event and to your report from the government? Because I was also thinking, you know, like for Ukrainian civil society, it's common to come to the international fora to complain, and then you get some reactions from the government and from the supporting state who can pressure the Ukrainian government. But with the US, it seems to be really complicated because, I mean, so what your hopes about this event and your report in general? Thank you.
Jeff, do you want to take a stab at that, or would you like someone else to take that?
Sure, I can take a stab at it. Yeah, I mean, you ask a good question. You know, I think there's two parts. What do we see, you know, is going to happen in the future here? And do we want, are we trying to get a reaction out of the government, or how do we get this to the government? Let me start with the latter. I think the idea here is that hopefully there is some reaction from the US government, though, as you can see, I'm not there currently, but as I've been told, there are no official US representatives at the OSCE. And in general, the feeling from the US government is to pull back from international commitments. So, but still, we're here, we're trying to make our voices heard. The idea is that once we have this report in a good state and finished, we would like to bring this up to congressional leaders, which the first question that was asked was talking about some congressional leaders that are trying to work on this issue. So the hope is to bring it to them. Unfortunately, I am a little pessimistic. I don't think everybody in Congress is paying attention to this. I think there's a lot of people in Congress that are happy of what's happening right now. As quite honestly, I think is made clear by the votes around the One Big Beautiful Bill. I think most people understood what was going to happen if ICE got all this surge in funding with all the rhetoric around the Trump regime. And there's still a lot of people that voted for it. I'm forgetting the first part of the question. Sorry.
Impact on Ukraine.
Was impact on Ukraine, or is it how we see things going in the next few months?
Yes, it's what's your predictions? What's your forecast?
I'd like to be optimistic, but I'm not very optimistic about what's happening. As Kate pointed out, our report is just scratching the surface. We've just started looking into this, and these enforced disappearances, the treatment of individuals by ICE has basically began since Trump got into office in January. There's months of missing information. As Lena pointed out, there's hundreds of cases. Quite frankly, there's probably a lot more, thousands of cases that we still haven't even uncovered yet. So this is just my opinion, and someone else can chime in and have a different opinion, of course, but I don't think things are going to get better in the next few months.
Thank you, Jeff. Any other questions? Here in the front and then to the back, yes.
What does the American people say? Are they also troubled and shocked, or do they say, okay, this is what we want from our president? We elected him with majority, or has there been a reaction? This was not what we imagined it would happen. So is there any research on the reaction among the American people?
I'll give a quick response to that, and then I see Lena had her hand up, and then anyone else who wants to chime in. There have been recent polls that show that that the majority of Americans are not happy with this particular issue of enforced disappearances, of detentions, and that the situation is worse than they imagined it would be. But again, it's very, very difficult to get information about this. There is a lot of protest, as our first, person who raised the first question said, is a lot of protest. There is a lot of pushback all around the United States. But the country is very polarized, and it depends on what the issue is. It depends on where you are. It depends on what part of the country you're in, and it depends on the specific issue. So there's not a lot of clarity right now, to be frank. Lena, you had your hand up. You want to give a brief response?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm one of, I think, the only people who lives in a very, very red state, and we have a very poor and rural population for the most part. So kind of, I think there is sort of a, like in the bigger cities, we have a lot more of a pushback against this. But I think a lot more people in the US are trying to survive a lot of these kind of cuts we've had recently, especially with the Big Beautiful Bill. I help people get like Medicaid and SNAP, which is food benefits, as well as part of my daily job outside of crude accountability. And we're seeing, like, even my state, like up to maybe 3-4 million people are going to be cut from that program. And so I think part of the problem is that by stripping away these benefits that people have relied on, they don't necessarily have as much energy to sort of like fight necessarily with this issue, because there's so many violations going on, or so many bad things are happening to the average person. Inflation as well is really high here. I'm seeing very much of like it reminds me, I used to live in Russia. It reminds me of my time in Russia, where it was very like doom and gloom, and like kind of a focus on a singularity of like survival. People here still support him a lot, and I don't think the connection is fully made to how much poverty and suffering is going on in my state, with the rollbacks in funding for Medicaid and SNAP. I'm just hearing, I mean, as someone who works with people who are losing their benefits every day, losing their Section 8, I'm just hearing complaints about, like, our local official or whatever. I don't think there's necessarily being made a broader connection to the regime itself. So it's kind of depressing in that sense that I think that people are working so hard to survive, and working so hard to retain what they already have access or retain the benefits that they have, or struggling so hard that a lot of time people don't have a lot of energy to like really think or be troubled by this. And it's honestly, frankly, a lot of the conditions issues are underreported by the media. They're kind of like tucked out of sight. Like, I mean, just the other day in the city next to mine, we had an entire restaurant full of Mexican workers that was taken and by ICE, and I didn't hear anything about it in the local news. I only heard about it from immigration attorneys I know in the area. So I think it's just, there's so much going on and so much suffering that it's hard for people to really give a full pushback, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Oglen Janeski. I'm a person of many hats, but in this particular reason here, I'm a side event speaker tomorrow, and also a US and UN research alumni. I was taking notes while all of you were speaking, and thank you very much for organizing this. I have to be honest that I came here because of solidarity. And I'm truly surprised and probably even a little bit depressed that the room is empty. Like this, for me, this is shocking. Especially knowing that so many CSOs that were surviving out of US money through the decades are here for this conference. It's a human dimension conference. And I don't see many of them inside. Briefly build on what Douglas said, and that this is a problem for us all. I totally agree. It is not something that the US should be facing alone. Listening to this discussion, and as someone coming from another part of the OSCE region, I come from the Western Balkans, from North Macedonia, I can't help but feel a certain paradox. For decades, the United States has helped many of our countries develop democratic systems. It was exporting democracy, strengthen the civil society, and resist authoritarian tendencies. But perhaps while doing so, I'm afraid it hasn't kept pace with how the rest of the world has evolved, including the, let's say, the darker arts, that being how autocracy modernizes, how technocracy disguises control, and how populism refines its language to sound democratic. What we are witnessing today is not an exception to global trends, but part of them. Many democracies, including mine, are struggling to recognize these new subtle forms of manipulation, especially when they come wrapped in a very familiar democratic words like the ones guiding the US today: the security, patriotism, prosperity, and public order. I have very, very brief three suggestions, maybe even simple offerings of solidarity and help. Perhaps the first step to treat civic and democratic literacy is to treat the democratic literacy as a living skill, not as a historical achievement. Because yes, you can achieve democracy, but if you're not learning how it evolves and how the threats around it evolve, then we have a serious problem. Every generation, including in established democracies, needs to learn again how to recognize propaganda, digital manipulation especially, and moral panic when they appear wrapped in patriotic and or humanitarian language as well. We might start by learning the second one. We might start by learning across the OSCE region, rather than always teaching down. Some of the most valuable lessons on resisting propaganda and preserving civic space now come from the smaller post-transition states that had learned the hard way. The flow of experience should no longer be one-directional. And the third, even a small step, would be to rethink the language, I will be talking about this tomorrow at my plenary, to rethink the language we use when describing control and security. If we begin naming new forms of authoritarian behavior precisely, without euphemisms, like I've been hearing tonight a little bit more, even when they occur at home, we already weaken them if we use the right language. Silence and vagueness are the most fertile soil for authoritarian growth. So perhaps the lesson for us all here, across the OSCE space, is humility. To remember, democratic literacy is not a fixed achievement, but a lifelong skill. Because in the end, democracy doesn't collapse in one day. It erodes very slowly in the silence between words and actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We appreciate your solidarity. And to be quite frank with you, why we are holding this side event is that we feel it's really important to say this here. We're losing our democracy so fast. It's stunning. So thank you for that. I know we're at the end of time. Are there any other questions? I don't want to hold you here longer than it's been a very long day. I would invite each of our speakers to say, one or two sentences very briefly, if you have anything that you want to add sort of after hearing these comments and questions, if there's anything you want to add as a final statement, you don't have to, but please be very brief if you want to. Jeff, I come to you first.
Sure. It's kind of hard to know what to say. I guess I would say I resonate a lot with what was just said by the last speaker. Democracy really is a continuous process that requires constant improvement and constant engagement. And if you begin to slip up and get lazy and not want to engage, which this is just my personal opinion, but I feel like that's also a reason why a lot of this is happening. That is just simply how the US population feels. Then you lose it. It slips away from you. And it can be very slow and it can be very quickly. And I think in the case of the United States, it's very quickly. As maybe one last remark with regards to the first speaker. I would love to hear some solutions about what to do in the United States. I would love it. I would love to have this discussion because I can't think of any at the moment. If you can think of, some part of the American government finally doing its job and checking the other parts of the government, that just isn't happening. There might be small parts of Congress that are doing that, but they are a minority. And I say that as someone with a Democratic representative in the House who has bowed down to everything that the Trump regime has done. So I'd love to have that conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Lena, very briefly, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just, I think that it's important to, no matter what, work on, even those of you who live in nicer countries politically than we do right now. We're seeing this throughout Europe and the West. We're seeing, inklings of this, far-right movements, the rise of, propaganda, not that it ever really went away. I just, I think it's, and to the first commenter, I did try to bring people with me who would come. All of the attorneys I spoke to, they want to be kept as anonymous as possible, which is why I never mentioned any states. And it even took me some convincing to get them to let me mention that they were an attorney at all. and they just try to speak to their clients. They're afraid. There have been people who have spoken out, who have, gotten deported very shortly after. They're afraid for their families. So it's not for lack of trying. I mean, I have had attorneys who won't even speak to me because they are so afraid of the retribution that could come back onto them. I mean, my grandparents came from Auschwitz many years ago to, leave authoritarianism. And, I've had many family members die. I have friends dying in Ukraine right now who were forced to be drafted there. And I think it's important that we fight for what we don't have and protect what we do, because I think a lot of people have gotten, complacent in some ways in terms of protecting the systems that we have and protecting the global order and looking out for one another. I'm
Thank you,
just
Lena.
very saddened. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Final word goes to you, Doug.
Oh, thanks, Kate. And I would thank everybody who engaged in the discussion, whether more critically or less critically, because I think everyone shared the same objective in this room and in defense of those who are not in this room tonight. There's a lot going on in the Warsaw Human Dimension Conference, and all of the side events are important. So we appreciate those of you who were here, and we hope those who were not will recognize that this is an important set of issues. I think the only thing I would say about solutions without a partisan approach, I did mention voting, but more generally, I think Lena just mentioned the word complacency. The problem of apathy or maybe willful ignorance of what's going on is still the biggest thing one has to overcome, because it's not necessarily any vast majority or even necessarily a majority that supports the policies that we've been talking about. It was narrowly a majority of those who voted in the last presidential election, but there are a lot of people who didn't vote in the last presidential election. And I think overcoming activism, mobilization through education, through a greater spotlight on what the abuses are, just as we used to say 40 years ago that one needed to put a spotlight on things that were happening behind an iron curtain that we couldn't see. We need a spotlight on things to see whether that can help us to mobilize those who will stand up for a more decent set of policies and a more dignified approach to our fellow citizens and non-citizens.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for being here, and please join me in thanking all of our speakers for their remarks this evening. Thanks very much, everyone.